Welcome to the review for the final exam for MBA 614 and IS 520. Why don't we begin with any questions? There may be some of you who have already spent some time studying the study guide and you have specific questions. If that's the case, go ahead and ask them, and we'll address those first. And then, I guess we still have time. We'll just kind of go through other generally go through the rest of the study guide. As you may recall, I told you in class that the first 75 points come by marking A on the first question. It's actually the first 79 points. So there's only 28 questions on the exam. Oof. There's 28 questions, including that one. So take 250 points, divide by 25, and you'll get the average. 28, and you'll get the average, knowing that one of them is 79. Let's see. So they're 5 points each on the multiple choice, that we're just looking at, and then they're 8 points each. So they're just 1 point more each than they were on the midterm. Question? The answer to your question is yes, but let me go ahead and restate it so that we hear it on the recording. Alt F11. Insert module. Okay, so let me go ahead and write the question in code so we can talk about it. Sub S1 on error. Let's do it this way. Let's put an error here. Debug.print 5 divided by 0. That should be an error. Run that. Sure enough, division by 0 is an error. So let's go ahead and say I have two errors here. 0. And let's skip the first one. So on error, resume next. Okay, so on error, resume next says if we run into a line of code that has an error, a runtime error, just skip it and move on. It is a really dangerous thing to have a statement in your code that says on error, resume next. And if you ever do this, you're saying very specifically you're going to limit this around a very small block of code. Because if you just put this at the top of your sub-procedure, you're saying, I don't know what I'm writing here, but if it didn't work, it probably wasn't important anyway, and just move on. So you don't ever want to do that. And so this line says, if there's an error, just skip it and keep moving. And it's only for runtime errors. Of course, syntax errors, you've got to fix before it'll compile at all. If there's an error, skip and keep going. Okay, so now we're going to say right here, I'm going to put the comment in first because it makes more sense. The comment makes a lot more sense than the line of code. Now, if there is an error, let's see. If there is an error hereafter, so from this point on, now we're saying if there is an error hereafter, I'll write it out. From here, behave in the normal way. What's the normal way for a runtime error? Stop the code, show the message to the error, highlight the line that has the error. That's the normal way. Now, the way we say this is bizarre. On error, go to 0. In the very early days of BASIC, we used to have to number our lines. You'd actually write, each line would have a number. This is line number 1, and you would write your statement. Here's line number 2, and you would write your statement. Line number 3, you would put the line number in. The very first legal line number was line number 1. And so, and you could actually just branch different parts of the code just by saying, go to this line. It was hideous. You don't want to be there. And so when you say go to 0, you're telling it to do something it can't possibly do. And that's That's what the interpreter goes, well, you told me to do something I can't do, so I guess I'm just going to have to behave like normal. It's a really weird syntax, but that's the way it is. That's the language. Yeah. So the comment is, so the only reason you say on error go to 0 is if somehow before that you said on error resume next, or on error go to, or on error. Yeah, there's a label. Go to a label. I forget the syntax. I almost never use it, but there's a syntax for that too. And so, right, yeah, this is just setting it back to the way it is out of the box. So now if I run this, we'll still get a runtime error because I've got a runtime error outside of the error trap, but when I say debug, you'll see that it's stopping on the second one. It skipped past the first one and stopping on the second one. Does that answer your question? Your question? You guys didn't change seats, did you? No. Okay. All right. Both handsome young men. Both handsome young men. Other questions? All right. Well, it's been a good review. Thanks for coming. Yes. So yeah, let's see what the question is on the. Probably just says understand the difference between pivot cache and pivot table. Okay. So let's take a look. Let's get ourselves some data here. Be good to have some data. Do I have data handy somewhere? I don't think so. So I'm going to pull in data. I'm going to download the example from when we're doing pivot tables because it's got some data that's formatted well for doing pivot tables. So pivot tables, I guess I can look for it. November 12th, thank you very much. Okay. All right, so it probably is, probably the best way for us to talk about this difference is just to go ahead and record ourselves making a pivot table. So let me go ahead and we'll record. I think I'm recording. Oh, I'm in break mode. Can't record in break mode. Stop. Cancel. Let me go ahead and close book one, so we only got one book open. Want to save it? No, I guess I'm not going to give out the example on the pivot table, or on the error handling. All right, now we should be able to record. Macro 1 is a great name. And I'm just going to insert a pivot table. Insert pivot table. Select the data, new sheet, all the defaults are fine. And let me just go ahead and put some things in here. So our value is going to be here under values. Let's see, let's put the crime type. So the label across the top. And let's put the state along the side, and that'll be enough. That's a reasonable table. So we're getting crime reported in all these different states that happened on university campuses, and there's the totals aggregated to the state level. Stop recording, and we should be able to take a look at that code. Modules, module 1. Okay. So this, when we record ourselves doing a pivot table, it conflates the construction of the pivot cache with the pivot table. So active workbook pivot caches.create. So this statement says we're creating a pivot cache. What is a pivot cache? So a pivot cache is an object that holds the data in such a way that it's easy to make a pivot table from it. If the only place we ever made pivot tables from was from data in Excel, there probably would not be a pivot cache, because the data that's stored in Excel is pretty easy to build a pivot table off of, and they'd probably just do that. But what a pivot cache, but the other place that we can build pivot tables from are like connection to a database or to a web page. And so here's the idea, is that we say, all right, we're gonna make a pivot table. First, cache the data. And so the pivot cache then gets its data from somewhere. And if it gets it from a database, then the pivot cache makes the request to the database and brings that data in. It holds it in the pivot cache. It's not on any worksheet. It's not sitting on the file. It's just loaded in memory. Can you have a pivot cache for data more than you have memory? It may do some writing out to disk. I'm not sure, because I think you can have enough data in a pivot cache that's even larger than your active memory is. But it definitely doesn't put it in the workbook. And so the idea is I've got that pivot cache, and it may be expensive to get that data, meaning it may take a long time to do it, and it may require a lot of resources on the database. It turns out you can write queries, like for even a commercial grade database management system, that take several minutes or even several hours to run. And then once you get the result, it's pretty small, but it can take a long time to get there. And so the idea is we don't want to have to refresh that query every time we want a new pivot table. Instead, bring that data in and and cache it. Put it in a pivot cache. That's what pivot cache is. And so we have this intermediate object that we can then say, now let's use that pivot cache to build a pivot table, right? So let's, just to isolate that, let's declare both a pivot cache and a pivot table object. PC as a pivot cache, and PT as a pivot table. Okay, so here's where we're creating, and this is a little bit weird, but open parenthesis here, all these parameters for the pivot cache, close parenthesis, that's the end of the create pivot cache method. Now, this right here, everything right up to here, returns a reference to the newly created pivot cache. That's why that evaluates to a pivot cache object. That's why we can say .create pivot table, because the create pivot table is a method of a pivot cache object. And so we're going to just split this up so we can see it. And I'm going to set my pivot cache equal to that. So now we're creating pivot cache and we're holding that reference. Instead of just using that reference to create a pivot table, we're holding that reference in an object. And then we can use that later to say, pc.create pivot table. And if we want to capture the response, set pt equal to, set pt equal to create pivot table. So now we're doing, so create pivot table is going to return a reference to the pivot table that's created, and we're doing something with the response from it. What are we doing? We're just capturing it. We want to take that reference and put it into a variable. So what do we have to add? We've got to put parentheses around the argument list. It's a little bit weird because there were parentheses around the argument list here because we were doing something with it. What were we doing before? We were calling a method of that object. In this case, there weren't parentheses because we weren't doing anything with the result of the create pivot table method. But now we are. We're holding it in a pivot table object. So now anywhere else we're referring to a pivot table, we can just say PT. And that's our reference to the pivot table. But that's the difference between those two. So we really could, how much code did that take? It'd probably take a little more than we want to do. But believe me, so we can say set pt equal to pivot table create, and then we could say set pt2 equal to, set pt equal to pivot cache create pivot table. And then we can use that same pivot cache object to create another pivot table and another. We could create 12 different pivot tables, all configured differently based off of this single pivot cache. And so that's the difference between a pivot table and a pivot cache, and I guess how they articulate with each other.
You need to dim PT or dim something as a table?
Yeah, we did right here. So dim PT as a pivot table. The question is that only if you want to put the pivot table into a variable? And the answer is yes. So that's the only reason we need to do that. So we could, the way this code records, every time it refers to a pivot table, it gets the pivot table by name. So we could give that pivot table a name that we know, and we could refer to it the rest of the way in the code this way. We wouldn't ever need a direct reference to the pivot table object. But the code is dramatically simpler when we do make a pivot table variable to hold that. Other questions here? Yep. So the question is, when you just create new, if you create multiple pivot tables from Excel, just make a new pivot table, does it create a new pivot cache? And the answer is no. It's smart enough to realize there's already a pivot cache made here. In fact, if you try to create a new pivot cache that's exactly the same as an existing pivot cache, it goes, yeah, we don't need that. We already got a pivot cache like that, and it will just bind your variable onto the same underlying object. So even if you're not savvy enough to split that out in your variables the way we are, Excel will prevent that, because a pivot cache is a heavy-duty thing, right? It's got a copy of the whole data that you're going to be manipulating. And if you make two of those, they really want to not have you get two of those objects in memory. Yep.
Do we need to know the arguments for the...
Oh, you need to know the arguments for the create pivot table, and the answer is no. No. So, yeah.
I just don't know a default version.
Yeah, default version, me either. So there's different versions of the pivot table object depending on which version of Excel you're using. And so even though, like the default version for Excel 2016 apparently is version 6, you could say I want this to be a Excel 2010 style pivot table. Yeah, which there's a reason why, apparently there's a reason why you may want to do that. I'm not sure what it would be, backwards compatibility or something. So yeah, but what I'm interested in, and you should kind of get this from the code. There were some, or from the midterm, there were some procedures, some statements that I wanted you to be familiar with. Like I wanted you to know how to do left. Left takes two arguments. What are they? String to operate in and how many characters from the left to return. So there are a few statements that I think these are ones that I want you to know the parameters from. But they're always going to be they're small ones, and I'm not even sure that there's anything from the second half of the class that rises to that level. I don't remember making any questions like that. Let me just look through real quick and see if anything stands out.
While you're looking through, could you tell us how many
It is cumulative. Okay, so first question's from before the midterm. That's 4 points. 5 points. Second and the third. The first three questions are from before the midterm. I think that's probably all. They're all multiple choice, but you mean the non-code interpreting ones? There are 16. And then 17 through 28 are look at the code and execute. Look at the code and tell me what it does. And they're all the same as it was in the midterm. This is going to write something to a cell. What did it write to the cell? I think. Create pivot table. So the question is, so what level do we need to know for the exam? Yeah, I think that's it. Understand that you create a pivot cache, and then a pivot cache has a method called create pivot table. Yeah, probably. I mean, if I was trying to think, I'm not sure. I'm pretty sure there's a question on the exam on that topic. But if I was writing that question again today, it would probably be, what do you do? Create a pivot table from a pivot cache, and I might give you a line of code. Here's a pivot table dot create pivot cache. Is that right? Or here's a pivot cache, create pivot table, or I don't know. Other questions? I came into work this morning at a little bit before 4 a.m. I woke up and my mind was programming. And I couldn't get it to stop. I couldn't go back to sleep. I might as well come in. What's that? I have a key. I can get in. And the whole morning I thought, I'm going to be tired by 1 o'clock, by the time 1 o'clock comes. And I'm probably going to forget the midterm review or the final review. And so the whole morning, is it time? Is it time? Is it time? Is it time? I thought I should have just put a reminder in my Google Calendar so I would just know to come. And then at 10 minutes before the review, a reminder rang, and I thought, I don't remember putting a reminder in. And I looked at it, and it's the faculty Christmas party right now. All right. So, question 1, the answer is A. I'm just going to, I'm kind of looking down now. And so if you have, what's that? Yeah, question 2, it's A or B or C or D or E. It's one of those. But let me just characterize some of these questions. So, I mean, some of the important things, some of the high-level things that we talked about, you better be able to kind of still look at a code and go, oh, yeah, I can see that that's an object. Oh, that's a property. Oh, that's a method. Pretty important to understand, what constants and variables and arrays are, and so forth. When these lines are processed. Okay, so I think there's a syntax that we didn't talk about in class that I'm expecting you to be a little bit familiar with on the final. So let me just do an example of it. A-R-R-A-Y. All right, if I'm making an array, dim z as string, is that an array? Does that declare an array? Yeah, it does. What kind of array does it declare? It's not a zero length. It's called, well, the name of it's not so important that but you understand the concept. This is called a dynamic array. So normally when we make an array, how do we do it? We say, I want a bunch of these things. How many variables does that create in that array? Yeah, 11, 0 through 10. And so that would be an 11 variable array. This is a dynamic array. It doesn't have any variables in it until we later say redim z and we put a size in it. Then there would be 11 variables in it. Okay, so that does not create a single dimension array or a zero dimension array. It creates a dynamic array that doesn't, it just says, we're going to tell you the size later. All right, so that was review. So let's.
Once you dim it, it becomes a static array.
Question is, once you redim it, it becomes a static array, and the answer is no, it's still dynamic. You can redim it and redim it and redim it to your heart's content. Yes?
Two things, but if you put the number up top, then you can't redim it later?
Yeah, let's do one of those now. Dim x10 as integer. You cannot redim this later. If you want to be able to change the size of an array, you've got to know up front and say, this is a dynamic array, and we're going to change the size with redim later. And you can't use it until you redim it, because you've got to give it its size. Okay, how many variables are created on this line right here? 11, numbered 0 through 10. Okay, now what if we had this? Then it creates 10, right? Because it specifically says, you know what? We think that there's enough beginners at programming. They don't want to think about zero-based arrays. They want to think about one-based arrays, and you can make it a one-based array by putting option-based 1. We didn't do that because you're better than that. But that's what that means. But here's a syntax we did not do. Dim y, or u, dim y 1 to 10. As long. In this case, we are declaring how many dimensions? So not how many variables, how many dimensions? Like, is it a one-dimension array? Is it a two-dimension array? Is it like a cube, like a three-dimension array? It's still one dimension. How many variables? Yeah, 10, numbered 1 through 10. Was that what you were thinking? Oh, good. How about this? Could I say like 11 to 100? And the answer is yes. That's also legal. So in this case, the first element in the array is index number 11. So yeah, I think in the study guide I said make sure you understand that as well, but we never talked about it. Questions here? There's a question.
Yeah, in the study guide it says this exam will deal with static arrays, but you're not familiar with it.
Why did I even tell you about dynamic arrays then? It's not on the exam. Yeah.
I'm just making sure the study guide is.
Study guide's right. Yeah, I was just thinking, we should review some stuff on arrays.
Those are inclusive, right? So this one,
Yeah, 11 and 100 are both in. There's a question in the back? Yeah, probably should take that out of the study guide and make it a dynamic array question next semester. Yep. Okay, so the question is, if I have an option base 1, does this become static? And the answer is, this is a static array regardless of what the option base, what the base is. There are two bases. There are two inferred bases you can have. You can have your array start counting at 1 or start counting at 0. That's the only possible. You could write option base 1, you could write option base 0. And all it says is if I only put one number here, what is the inferred lower boundary? Yeah, well, no, in this case it's 1 because it's option base 1. If it didn't have it or said option base 0, this would be start at 0. So option base says if you only give me one number for the dimension, that's always the top index, what's the bottom index? Yeah. I think it's unnecessary, right? Because you could always, if you really wanted to do an array that starts at 1, you could use this. I don't know why we have the option base. I wish we didn't, but there it is. Question? Any other? Does option base do anything besides just set the default bottom index for an array? And the answer is no. That's all it does. Anything else? Yes. Oh yeah. So two-dimensional array. Dim q 1, 2. How many dimensions are here? 2 dimensions. How many variables? Not 4. Not 6. Oh, wait, maybe 6. Yeah, 6. Because there's two variables here. It's 2 by 3. Right, so it's 6. So my valid indices are going to be start at 0, 0, and go up to 1, 2. So I've got 0, 0, 0, 1, 0, 2, 0, 3. No. 0, 0, 0, 1, 0, 2. 1, 0, 1, 1, 1, 3. That's exactly what it is. It's a matrix. That's right. Yes?
So if it's Q, let's say 0, 2, that started at...
Ooh, that's kind of a tougher question. How many dimensions? Not how many variables. There's 3 variables, but how many dimensions? Still 2 dimensions. That first dimension is kind of bizarre because there's only one legal value for it. It's 1 row with 3 columns, or it's 1 column with 3 rows. As long as you're consistent, you can think of it either way. Yeah, but it's still it's still a 2-dimensional array. I'm not going to give you anything that's that picky on the exam. Okay, so the question is, how do we refer to this? And here's the answer. So there's 2 dimensions. I have to supply 2 indices. So I can say 0, 1. That's identifying one of the variables in that array of variables, and it's a string. So that just gives me an indexing system to say, how am I going to refer to all the variables I just created? Yep.
The 0, 2, making your life harder, basically.
Oh yeah, this would be crazy to declare an array with the first dimension in 0, because this gives you exactly the same number of variables as this does, a 1-dimension array. And all it means is that every time you refer to it, you've got to start off by saying 0, comma. Yeah, it's legal syntax, but there's no good reason to do that. There might be a good reason to do that. You want to hear the good reason to do that? So I might have some kind of function that I'm passing an array to, and this function can work on a 2-dimensional array. And so when I'm passing the values to that function, it needs to be a 2-dimensional array, but it happens that I only need 1 row. I only need 1 set of the data. And so, yeah, there's kind of a valid reason why you might do that, but it's a really kind of an edge case. In the back. The error trap after 22.5. 22.5. Let me zoom in just a bit here. This is right here. Oh, look, I got a whole subprocedure here. Let's take this out of Word and put it in Excel. Error trap 1, file path as string, file path equals, enter a path. Okay, so that's always dangerous. Anytime you let someone type in a path, they're going to get it wrong. If the file path is blank, get us out of here. That's a pretty reasonable thing to do. Now we're saying if there's an error, just keep on going. So I want to kind of find out where this error kind of ends. Just keep going. Oh, okay, so here's where I'm looking to see what we have here. Oh, here's the end. So let me just break this into my code. Let me break this into a block so I can kind of see that as a little error trap. Okay, so this says, listen, if there's an error, just keep on moving. We're going to try to open up this workbook, wherever the user typed the path in. We don't know if the user typed in a good path or not, so we're going to try to open it. Now, it's either going to open the workbook or it's going to have an error, but because I've said resume next, it's not going to, the error will be silent. We'll skip and move on. But in that case, the workbook won't be open. So then we're saying if the error number is 0, what does error number 0 mean? There's no error. So what else do we know about the code at this point? We have successfully opened the workbook. So the workbook is open. And so if the error number is 0, we're saying get out of here, exit my do loop. Okay, great. So now we'll drop right here and we'll continue on. Oh, let's see. Exit do. Here's the loop right here. So now we're saying on error go to 0, and then we've got something else that we'd be doing with that open workbook. Okay, so now let's consider that it fails. So the error number is something besides 0. So here we are at the do loop. We try to open it, it fails. If error number is 0, exit do. It wasn't 0, so we don't exit it. So we hit this on error go to 0. So that turns off the error trap. Now we put up another message box. There was an error opening the file. Do you want to try again? Oh, so this is a message box instead of an input box that we had before. So you just put something in that said, open this file, and sorry, I couldn't do it. Do you want to try again? So we're probably going to have to handle both of those. So if, oh, here's an interesting thing I've done here. We don't do this very often, but it's legal. So message box is a function. What's it going to return? Not true or false. It's going to return, let's see. Whoops. It's going to return either VB yes or VB no, which are just constants. VB yes. VB yes is 6, and I think VB no is 7. VB now is nothing. And so this message box function right here, is going to return either 6 or 7. And so what I'm saying is, if this whole function returns 7, which is what VB no is, then we're done. Get us out of the subprocedure. Right? Do you want to try again? No! Great, we're done. We're out of here. You want to try again? Yes. If they say we want to try again, yes, then we're going to skip by the then, and we're going to hit the loop, and that's going to take us right back up, and it's going to ask for them to type in the file path again. We're going to try to open it. If it succeeds, we drop out of the loop. If it fails, we tell them there was a problem and we ask again. So this is really a pretty clean, short example of a good use of an error trap. It's kind of a clean little error trap. Except for the fact that we like to avoid people typing in paths if at all possible. Go ahead. There's a question over here. Yep.
Yeah, so the error number still goes up even though it ignores the error, right?
Yes, the question is the error number gets assigned even though it ignores the error, and the answer is yes. That's the whole point. The error number gets assigned so that we, as the programmer, can know an error happened. You know, we're kind of running without a net here. I don't know who Annette is, but she does a lot of running, but we're running without her. And if there's an error, we're going to keep going. And so we need to be able to say, let's know that an error happened. And that's how we do it, is by looking at the error object. Oh, yeah. So am I going to expect you to know that error number 9 is an overflow and error number 5? No, not at all. But you do need to know error number 0 means there's no error.
Also, that error number signed up.
And that the question is, and that error number gets assigned a value whether or not you have on error resume next. Whether you ignore it or not, yeah. If there's an error, the error object has been populated. Question? So what do we need this one for? Let's follow through what happens if the error number is 0. So we come in here, we get a file path, and so we don't exit the sub procedure. We say if there's an error, just keep right on moving. We try to open the workbook. Error number is 0, so it's succeeded. We say exit do. We drop right to here. And if we don't have this statement here, we're still running with on error resume next. So there's nothing to see here. I mean, I don't know why the workbook would fail to close, but the idea here, there's other code that's happening here, and you don't want to go into that code with on error resume next still on. So you have to make sure that the direction that your code goes, you're going to hit the on error resume next at the appropriate time. Question?
Also, on error telling that you have to handle it.
Yeah, let's take a look at on error go to line label. Sub E2. Okay, so this is another common way to do an error trap. So the error trap that we've seen so far is the preferred one, where you say, I'm looking at this part here and I'm saying, that could cause an error. I'm going to write code right around that to protect that from the error. Another way is to say, I don't know where the error is going to be. On error, go to error handler, Handler.
Why is this not preferred?
I'll tell you why here in a minute. So now I'm going to come down here and put so down here, this is the code that I only want to execute if we have an error. So this is error code. Now, because this is just a sub-procedure, if I come running right down through here, I'm going to, and I go without an error, ultimately I'm going to get to this line. And there's nothing magic about this. This is just a marker that says this is a place that you can jump to. And so if I ever make it to here, I'm going to say exit sub. So this now becomes the effective end of my sub procedure. If I get to here, just take me out so I don't accidentally bump into the error handler. And so debug.print in handler. Okay, so I run this right now. It shouldn't print anything. So it doesn't ever hit that handler. But now if I say debug.print, 1 divided by 0, and run that, now that gets down to the error handler. The reason that I don't prefer this approach, and when I say it's not, when you say it's not preferred, you're saying it's not preferred by me. There are a lot of people who think this is a great way to do it. It's because now, if I've got several things that could go wrong in my code up here, when I get down here, I've got to say, was it this? Was it this? Was it this? Was it error number? And the trouble is, once I get down here, I don't know the line the error happened on. So I don't get any information about where the error happened. All I know is that an error happened, and this is what error number it is. And so if I've got a block of code and I think I can't see anything possibly wrong with this code, I can't imagine this ever going wrong, then it's not a bad practice to say, let me just put this structure in my code to say, well, maybe I haven't anticipated something. And so I'm going to put something here that actually sends me an email. I got someone else using this code, and if we ever hit this error handler, I'd like to know what sub-procedure it was in. I'd like to know what the error was, and that way I can be alerted. Wow, someone using my code just had an error. I better go see Marge in accounting and see what she's doing, because she's doing something I never expected her to do if she got there. So that's the place that I think that's really handy. Yep.
Why send it to a sub procedure so that you don't have to exit sub of error?
The question is, why can't you jump just to another subprocedure? On error, And the truth is, I'm not sure that you can't. Exit sub, on error, go to line, go to 0. Yeah, it looks like you can't. At least I'm not seeing that straight away. Take a little more research to be sure that you can't. Yeah, the language just doesn't allow it. On error, run sub. Let's see if anyone's talking about that. Is it possible to call a sub on an error? Oh, Stack Overflow knows everything. Here's the answer, no. Best you can do is branch to a separate section of the code. Yeah, so that go to has to be somewhere else inside the same subprocedure. You can't go to, thank goodness, oh my gosh. If you could like branch to another location, another subprocedure, just keep executing from here, there's no reason that VBA couldn't do that. It doesn't, thank goodness. That's a nightmare. So when I was a student, I wrote like a study program for Biology 100 to like learn the various vocabulary terms, and it's sold as an optional textbook in the bookstore. I was pretty proud of myself. And it was written, for DOS. It was before Windows, even. And it was a pretty good program. I thought, I'd like to change the opening screen color on this program. And I kind of after I'd been selling it for a year, and I went back to the source code, and I went to try to change it. And that sounds like a really simple thing to do, and it should be. But the code was so bad with all these go-tos where you're jumping from one place to another. It was terrible code. I couldn't even do it. I gave up and said it's going to look exactly the same this year as it did last year. Anyway, so there's real reasons that they've kind of constrained us as to what they're letting us do, even though it certainly could be more flexible. And it's because we're trying to protect you from yourselves. Because the truth is, you, as a group, you write really bad code. You're beginners. And so we're trying to protect you from yourselves. Yep. Chapter 27, ribbon modification. Do I not even put anything in the study guide about that? Yeah, okay, so let me just read what it says here. Be able to look at XML for a simple ribbon modification, such as one that adds a tab that includes 3 buttons, and be able to determine which VBA subprocedure will be invoked when the user clicks each button. It almost sounds like I'm describing a particular question on the exam, and I probably am. So let's see if we have, fortunately, we've got code that looks kind of like that. If we just can go download a workbook, which I think I have. Oh yeah, I should have the example from just earlier this week. So that's in downloads. Ribbon. Fallen Angel should have it. Okay, so I'm just going to go look at the, how come Fallen Angel doesn't have a custom UI interface? Erg. New ribbon 1. There was a custom UI. Let's look at this one. Okay, so I'm going to simplify this down to just one group. So here's a ribbon modification with a new tab. So it's making a new tab, it's labeling that tab assignment, and it's putting, let's see, Alt-Z. It's putting 2 buttons onto that tab. Let me get a little more space, vertical space, to make these buttons stand out just a bit. Okay, so in this case, if the user, there's 2 buttons, just someone tell me, what do these 2 buttons say? There's some images there, but there's text on the button. What do the buttons say? Yeah, it's the button's label. So process tickers and clear results. That's what the buttons say. So now the question is, which subprocedure gets executed when the user clicks on the button labeled process tickers? That is like a question that could show up on the final exam. What VBA subprocedure gets executed in that case? Yeah, it's called run button. Oh, in this case, they both run the same, so that would be kind of a bad question. because it's the same no matter which one you look at. So how can these two buttons do different things? No. They do. These buttons currently in this workbook that we took this from, they currently do two totally different things, right? One processes tickers and one clears results. How could that possibly be? I heard some mumbling. Nope, same module. And even if it was different modules, that would be a collision, right? You'd have two procedures with the same name. It'd be no good. I heard someone say it.
Well, he said it has to do with the ID, and that sounded better than what I was going to say.
Ah, yes. Good, because that's right. But what were you going to say?
I was going to say you could just have one sub called run button, and it says, like, if there's already data, then clear it, and if it's not, then do the other.
Oh, yeah, so that's another possibility, right? You could look at the state of the workbook and decide what to do. But you're right. The ID is a better way. So because when the ribbon when Excel says the ribbon got clicked, it's going to call run button and it's going to pass, not the ID, but it's going to pass a reference to this control. So it's an object with some properties in it. And one of the properties is the ID. So you can look at the ID that got passed in and say, what do I want to do based on what the ID is? But that won't be on the exam. If this is on the exam, it'll be something more like this. There'll be two different names for the on action. Can you look at this and say, I can tell what the buttons look like, I can tell what code's going to be executed under which situation.
Are ID, label, size, on action, image, are those properties?
The question is, are these properties of this tag? And the answer is yes. So ID is a property. They're called properties. Actually, I think technically in XML they're called attributes, but same idea. Sounds like they're cleaning up out there, vacuuming. Probably time for us to go. No, another question. Anything else on the XML here? Yep.
Would that just be in the tab packet and then adding those attributes in it?
That's right. So that's exactly what this one does. It adds a tab, and it has these buttons on it. By the way, if I wanted to call this tab home, would that be enough to make it go onto the home tab? The answer is no. It's IDMSO. I guess we're going to his house on Tuesday. This is beyond what I'm expecting you to know for the exam, but this is just, you can say I want to modify, and you can't. In that case, you can't change the label. I want to modify an existing tab, and so here I'm identifying an existing tab, and now I'm going to put a new group on that tab and put buttons in that group. So you have to come up with the right ID, and you have to tell it it's not a newly created ID, but it's a Microsoft Object ID. Okay, where did you want to go? Understand that controls and building blocks for user, understand that controls, it's a really bad point. I'm going to skip the word that for a minute. Understand controls and understand that controls are the building blocks for user forms. I'll edit this here so I'll feel good about myself, but there's no chance that I'm going to remember to put this back in the main thing. Anyway. Understand that controls are the basic building blocks for user forms and how code can be executed automatically when a control receives an event. Is there a specific question there? We feel okay with that, or do you want to see something? So what's a control? Give me an example of a control in a user form. A label is a control, another one? A button, a text box, these are all controls. The little things that we put onto the form. Now, if I wanted to make something happen when the user clicks on the button, what do? Double-click the button, and it will create a sub-procedure that's called object name _ click. And then now, when that object, and here's the key, is that when an object, in the world of forms, when an object receives an event, we can make code execute. And that's really a big difference in how we thought about code in every other setting. In every other setting, we say, here's a program, run it. And it just goes through it. In this case, we say, here's a form, show it, and now we've got lots of little blocks of code all over the place, just waiting for their moment, their moment to shine, hoping that their object will receive their event, and they can execute. And most of the time they don't. They just sit around going, I just ran the form and I didn't get used this time. But that's the big difference. Make sure you understand that. So show, hide, load, and unload. Let's just go over these. So, and we did an example of this, I think, in class last Wednesday. So form can be in 3 states. It can either be on the disk, not in memory, not on the screen. So it's not open at all. It can be open and showing on the screen. That's all the way at the other end. But there's a middle no man's land in there. And that's where it has been loaded but not shown. So you can say load this form, and that brings it into memory. And then before you show it, you could like totally change it. That's exactly what we did. So you may or may not remember this, but when we were trying to get the username for a BYU NetID, the NetID and a password, the form we were using was set up for Google. So we loaded the form, and then we said, change this label's caption to say BYU NetID. And then after we changed it, we showed it. So it never was visible until we'd made the adaptations that we wanted to it. Then, once you've got it shown, if you say hide, what does it do? It goes back one level. It goes back to still being in memory. Everything the user's done on that form is still there. You can still read all the controls and what's there and whatever. And if the user says show, if you cause it to be shown again, it'll show it, and whatever was on the form still is on the form. But if you unload it, it goes all the way back down to just being on the disk, and then you say show, it's got to reinitialize it again from the disk, and it comes back as a brand new copy. So you got 3 positions, and so you have 2 methods that move you between those going up and move you between them going down. So load it, show it, unload it. The normal path is load it, then show it, then hide it, then unload it when you're done. Question?
Do you have to load it and then show it, or just show?
Yeah, could you just skip the load and say show? And the answer is you can skip the load and say show. Because if you say show, it goes, yeah, I guess we better load it first. And in fact, it used to be you could not access the controls on it until you had loaded it. Like if you just said, I want to refer to a control here, it would say, sorry, it's not loaded into memory. And people said, well, couldn't you load it into memory for me? And they did. So now if you just refer to it, it'll load automatically. So that's that. What else do we have in here? Be able to look at the code of a form module that contains general procedures and event procedures, and we'll tell which is which. Understand why and when event procedures are activated. Be particularly familiar with the click event. Let's look at an example. I'm not really going to do this in a form module. Pretend this is a form module. I'm looking at this one. Is this a general procedure or an event sub-procedure? It's general. How can you be sure? Because if it's an event sub-procedure, you've got to say name of a control, underscore, the name of an event. So if you look at the name of a sub-procedure and there's no underscore, it can't possibly be an event sub-procedure. It can't. It could say this. It could say, button 1, click. Button 1, C-L-I-C-K. C-L-I-C-K. Looks like an event sub-procedure, but there's no underscore, so it can't be an event. So what kind is it? It's a general sub-procedure. There's only 2 kinds: event sub-procedure and general procedure. General sub-procedure. I don't know. I think it's click. I'm sure it's click. Yeah, it's just name of the object underscore click. It's not on click. It's click. Oh, now that I put that in recording, I better go check. I wouldn't mind just saying that and not being 100% sure if you guys are going to walk away and forget it anyway, but insert module, no, insert user form and button. Yeah, click. Okay. There are some events that may start with the word on, but not that apply to a button. Whew, we've been at this an hour. What's next? How far did we get through the study guide? We did 26. We did arrays. We did that whole example. Go to pivot table, pivot cache. Holy cow. Stop, step into. We did the whole thing. No wonder you don't have any more questions. Question?
What about step out?
Step out. So, step out's only relevant if you're stepped in, if you're step into, or if you're executing in a sub-procedure that has been called from another sub-procedure. Okay, so you're down somewhere. I stepped into this thing, and I'm going line by line, and I realize the problem's not in this sub-procedure. Let me just finish. Just finish this whole sub-procedure. Take me back to the call. That's what step out does. So step out finishes executing without stepping. It finishes executing that sub-procedure and takes you back to where that sub-procedure was called from. It's really handy when you accidentally step into. When you meant to step over and you step into, you can step out. I don't want to look at this code. Just run this. Take me there. Question? Good question. What do you think? So I said step into this sub-procedure. It came down here, ran the whole thing. When it comes back, is it going to be on that same line again? If it is, what will happen if I say step again? It would execute it again. So it'll actually come to the next line after that. So there's a good reason why it goes there, but the truth is it would be nice if it went back to that same line that it was called from, but was like somehow marked as, you've already run this line. And the reason is you might be in a sub-procedure that could be called from 12 different places. That would take you there. No, the problem is when you call a sub-procedure as the very last statement in your sub-procedure, you step out, there's nothing else to look at in that sub-procedure, and it goes back to wherever that one was called from. And so it would be nice if there was a way to tell it, go back to the very line it was called from, but it goes to the next executable line. Question?
Clarify then. So the step out is that in case you accidentally step into like all the sub-procedure and you're like, I don't care about into line by line, just take me to the next one in the original, then you step out and then you.
That's exactly right. And I'm wondering if I should repeat it for the video. But it's pretty much what I said earlier. So if you're wondering what that student just asked on the video, rewind about a minute. But yeah, that's what it is. You had that right. Question? So on error go to label is this. Hopefully I still have that example alive. Or did I close it? Maybe I closed it. Curse myself. Watch the video. Was that it? Why is it not scrolling? I thought it was, oh, yeah, it is here. Good. Whew. On arrow, is it actually there? Oh, yeah, it's actually the one that's showing. Yeah, on error, go to this label, and that's just a marked place in the code. When you put a word and put a colon right after it, that's a label. That says, it's just a point that you can jump to when you're handling errors. In the back? So the question is, can you have a label without ever using it? And the answer is yes, no problem. So that will just, because all it is it's a mark. It says this is a location in the code. And realize that label does not cause this to be skipped over. This is what's causing this to be skipped. It's the exit sub that's saying don't execute this code down here. Without the exit sub, it just executes right along and gets to the label, goes, great, here's a label, move on, and we'll just keep going right through it. So let's go ahead and the question is, what if this exit sub's not here? Okay, so let's make this so that we don't have an error. So now there's no error, but when I run this, it still tells me I'm in the handler because it's still getting into that code from the handler. It's just running down, no error. We got to the error handler, and it goes. It doesn't know that. It doesn't understand that the label means anything to do with an error. Just you might want to go here sometime. Great, and then just keeps executing right through it. Yep.
When the next step over, it acts the exact as step 2. Procedure.
Good question. Let's just take a look at it. So we have another substitute. I can't scroll. Why can't I scroll? So here's error trap. We're going to call error trap 1 from button click 1. And we are going to execute. Let's see, F8 will start me by stepping into it. All right, so I'm pressing F8, which is just step into. When I get to error trap 1, F8 takes me into error trap 1, and I start going line by line through error trap 1. Now, if I realize I don't want to be in here, I want to step out, which is Control-Shift F8. And that's going to finish executing error handler and take me to the next line here. But if I'm up here, I'm finished executing error trap. If I press F8, it's going to go step into that. If I want to step over it, I'll do Shift F8, and it's going to execute that whole thing, which includes putting up a message box, yeah? So it's doing that, and then finishing that off and moving to the next line of executable code. So step out is going to finish running this sub-procedure and take me back to where it was called from, which was nowhere. So yeah, it'll conclude the program. Control-Shift F8. We're done. Yep.
So is it safe to say, like, step into goes one at a time, step out of and step across or over? Both of those basically still step into, click a whole bunch of times until a certain point?
So the question is, is it okay to think of it this way? That whenever time I say step into, it's going to execute one line, period. One line, one line, one line. But if I do step out, it's going to be just the same as pressing step into a bunch of times until it gets to a certain place. And the answer is yes. So step out just says, I just pretend I press step into a whole bunch of times. There's a slight difference. It doesn't affect the code execution. You want me to tell you what the difference is? When you hit step into, you actually activate that line in the editor. And so if you've got some long nested deeply problem, when you hit that error, it sometimes, in fact often, when you get the runtime error, it doesn't show you the actual line that the error was on. It goes to the highest function call from that. And so you may not say there's an error and it will take you back up somewhere. You won't even see the line that caused the error. But if you lay on the F8 key and just go to it, it actually activates that line. So when you have the error, you hit stop, that's where you are. So it can be handy, although sometimes annoying to say, I just want to hold this down, even though it might take a minute or two to actually for the code to get to the place, because it runs really slow. It's activating each line in between. Anything else? Yep. Sure. Question is split and upper bound. So let's look at split. Let's print first just a string. So we've got a string here, and we will just print it, and it just, of course, prints that string. But now let's split it. If I do not give it a character to split, the default is spaces. And so that's going to split this into an array with 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 0 through 5 indices. So I should be able to come here and say number 5, and that should be the fifth word. I should be able to say 1, that should be Nephi. So this evaluates to an array based on that string that we had there. So because that's an array, I can ask for the upper boundary of it. What's that going to tell me? Upper boundary of that. What should it say? Yeah, 5. Now, what if I split it on a particular character instead of space? What if I split it on E? Then that will be my first block. That will be my second block. Ooh. What's going to be in my 0, 1, 2? What's going to be in my second block? An empty string. Yeah. I've got 2 of the things to split. There's nothing in between it. It still splits there. There's just nothing in between it. So that upper boundary should be, how many E's do I have? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Should be 5. Right, mismatch. Well, I got it on the wrong side. Yep, I put that in the wrong argument. Still 5. It's a different 5, but still splits. So that's default for splits. The default character for split, the default delimiter is a space. Right. The question is, split only works with strings? And the answer is yes. Did you like that, the way I said that? But it may convert a number into a string. I've never tried it. Let's give it a shot. Let's put a number here. And then let's split that on 4. How'd that give me a subscript out of range? Oh, I got it in the wrong place. So it's a number, and it says, hey, you're trying to split this thing. I can make a number into a string. It converts into a string, and then it splits it based on that. This doesn't even have to be in quotes either. It'll convert this one as well. Ubound returns the upper boundary, so the highest index. Yeah, and that combination is powerful because you can say, I want the, imagine that you're trying to get the file name off of a path, split by the path separator. Where's the file name? It's at the very last one, but you don't know what the very last one is. You can ask for the upper boundary, and that'll pull it out. Anything else? I have never held a final exam review. I am now worried that you will do too well on this exam. Yeah. That would be horrid. It would be just terrible. Terrible. Yeah. That's right. There we go. But we learned so much. That's the way it should be. I'll have to write a harder exam. I'll have to write questions for those first 79 points after all. All right. Class dismissed.